So I'm passing out a handout which has on it the quotes, because I have to quote from all over Heidegger stuff to make the case that I want to make. And so, and I think the handout is mixed up. At the last minute, I realized that the numbering isn't right. So there may be moments of confusion while I try to figure out which number quote I really want. And I'll put it on the website, but tomorrow or so, after I make sure that where the quotes are what the numbering of them is supposed to be. That's it. Today we're going to finish Heidegger's sections on realism, and then we have vacation, and then we do truth and the two introductions. We're almost done. And any questions or any problems? Anybody actually try to sign up for the course, the 189, and get on it, in it? You can get in it now. Okay. Well, that's good. So this is going to be a rather complicated lecture. I'll try to make it as clear as I can. The situation is really confused and complicated. I've been changing my mind every time I give the course for the last, 30 years as to what Heidegger really thinks about science and realism, which is what I'm interested in, because I think he's in a position to have an interesting, important contribution to make. But every time I try to deal with it, two things. There's always this constant debate between the idealists like Bill Blattner and the realists like me and I think John Hoagland, maybe, or at least me. And it's not, and I'm beginning to see this time, it's no accident. I'm going to try to show that Heidegger has a view which should lead him to some kind of deflationary realism, some kind of view that there isn't any important difference between the reality of baseballs and the reality of electrons. And second, he doesn't want that view. It's no accident that, having been a physics and math major as an undergraduate, he never got over it. I understand that perfectly. That happened to me too. I mean, you really believe, if you've done some physics, that physics is telling you something about an independent reality. So Heidegger wants to be what I'm calling a robust realist, but he hasn't really got the equipment to make the argument, so that he's sort of a dogmatic robust realist. And it's even more complicated because he has the equipment to make the argument, he just doesn't use it. So you can make out of what is running around in Heidegger of a coherent, I think convincing, robust realism position, namely that science studies the universe and it studies those beings in the universe like electrons and galaxies and black holes and all that, and it studies their essential structure, and they have that structure whether anybody ever studies them, whether we ever existed or not. I mean, that's certainly what most scientists think they're doing, and it seems to me it's what they must be doing and ought to be doing. That now, to get there from Heidegger is hard, but to get there any other way, as far as I know, is even harder. So here we go. So we're in the reality chapter. To remind you, because it's been a while, last time it looked like the reality chapter is a kind of deflationary realism. After all, it shows that the world is, as I think I quoted Charles Taylor as saying, or maybe I just stole the term, the world is a co-production. It's something that Dasein and nature together produce, like hammers. I mean, you can't, hammers are a co-production. They have to fit into the referential whole, and that's Dasein, and Dasein has to be there to have a referential whole because it connects up with Dasein's for the sake of which, finally, what it is to be a hammer. But, of course, it also has to be have a present-at-hand causal basis, or you can't have a hammer. As I keep saying, you can't hammer with pillows and ice and butter and all sorts of things, your bare hands either. So there you are. But if reality is a co-production, then, of course, Heidegger is going to be a deflationary realist, not a robust realist, because you certainly can't have hammers if there aren't Daseins around, and maybe you can't have anything, any objects at all without Dasein. Maybe out there in the universe, so to speak, there's just chaos until we carve it up into what I mentioned last time Ian Hacking calls functionally relevant groupings. That is, we carve it up in ways that make sense and are useful to us. Now, that, and it's further complicated by the fact that even if it looks like nature and the universe are independent of us, we wouldn't be in a very good position to know, because we will bring our Vorhabe, our forehaving, our foreconception and all, with us whenever we looked at the universe or the world, and we don't know that we live inside this pervasive familiarity, and there's really, you could say, no reason to think that we ever get outside, or even could get outside the pervasive sense of familiarity and what it is to be, which we live inside of, but it's so pervasive and it's so much in our practices that we can't even see it. And then you get the idea that scientists, too, are working in their familiar setting, their laboratory, and they have their forehaving about nature. And even if nature was a co-production, maybe they wouldn't see it. I mean, they might just think they're transparently getting it the way nature really is. So what are we supposed to think of all that? Well, Heidegger says, and I think we got to believe this, that all beings depend for their intelligibility on our practices for encountering them, and yet all beings are independent of our practices for encountering them. That's the deflationary realist story. It's something like we make sense of everything that we encounter, and that we make sense of it all as, in some sense, not dependent on our encountering it. I mean, where's the? Did I give away all the handouts? Oh, here's one. I'll get it. Oh, okay. Thanks. So look at number 1 now in your handout. That's the statement of this. This is what I want. What's interesting about this is, I mean, that being or intelligibility depends on us seems so obviously Heideggerian and obviously true that it's the other thing that seems interesting and strange, namely that Heidegger could be some kind of co-production, deflationary kind of realist, and still claim that all the beings which we encounter don't depend on us. But that's what he says. Now, this is from the history of the concept of time, I hope. I mean, as I say, all of this got a little scrambled in the computer. But wherever, and I'll give you a more reliable handout, but I mean, the words are right. The references might not be. Anyway, the being of entities does not lie in the activity of encountering, but the encounter of entities is the phenomenal basis and the sole basis upon which the being of entities can be grasped. That's all good old Heidegger. So we make the clearing, and then things show up in it. But he says only the interpretation of the encounter with entities can secure the being of entities, if at all. That's all the being is relative to us part. Now comes the beings are independent of us part. It must be stated that the entity, fix that, the word is das Seiende, and you can translate that, the totality of entities, because the entity doesn't make any sense there. What entity? So it must be stated that the totality of entities, as a totality of entities, is in itself and independent of any apprehension of it. Accordingly, and I think you might better say yet the being of the totality of entities is found only in encounter and can be explained and made understandable only from the phenomenal exhibition and interpretation of the structure of encounter. So that's a funny paragraph, you see. because he's talking about the totality of entities as they are in themselves and independent of any apprehension we have of them. And he's saying, of course, all access we have to them is our access and is a function of our practices. That's hard to understand. No wonder it keeps generating. If you believe half of it, it sounds like obviously everything we ever experience depends on us in the sense that it fits into our referential totality. And it also seems to be saying, of course, anything we encounter and apprehend it as it is, quote, in itself, where in itself always or normally is taken to mean without any reference to us. That's the Kantian use of in itself. Now, Heidegger can't quite be meaning that by in itself, but he means something like everything we come across, except things that we made or something. But I mean, most of the entities we come across them as existing in their own right, independent of whether we come across them or not. I mean, it's true in both of them. And now the question is how to get it together. But before we go further, this isn't something just said, of course, in the history of the concept of time, which is written a year before Being in Time, but it's said in its most dramatic form in Being in Time, in a place where I've already cited it once, but the whole text of this lecture and the previous one is in these two sentences. There, on 228, first full paragraph, I read it last time. Entities are, quite independently of the experience by which they are disclosed. That's the realism part. The acquaintance with which they are discovered, and the grasping in which their nature is, that isn't in the German, by the way, in which, and that might be important. So discovered and the grasping by which they are ascertained. I don't know how the grasping by which they are experienced, I guess, whatever, something like that. I'd have to go back and look, but I wrote in the margin that the nature is not in the German. I'm on 184, 183, two-thirds of the way down. Help me see what's going on there. The paragraph that begins, entities are, the end of that sentence. They're independent of the acquaintance in which they're discovered, that's fine, and the grasping in which something. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear you. So, and anyway, it wouldn't help everybody else. So, what I'm looking for at the end of the sentence, I don't think there's any nature in there, though it would be fine if there were. So, how do you do it without nature? Okay, how it is entertained, that's fine, instead of ascertained, because ascertained's okay. I see, it is ascertained, okay. But it's going to turn out that Heidegger really thinks that they have a nature, so the fact that it doesn't show up there isn't going to make a big deal later. But now, that's the way the entities are, independent of our experience of them, our discovery of them, our grasping of them. But being is only in the understanding of those entities in whose being something like an understanding of, to whose being something like an understanding of being belongs. Who are they? That's us, of course. So being depends on us, but entities don't. That's the same old puzzle again. And one more time, because since, as I say, that puzzle is what we're going to be puzzling about the whole lecture. So on 255, he comes back to it. The third full paragraph. As we have noted, being, not entities, is dependent upon the understanding of being. That's the half of it. That is to say, reality, not the real, is dependent on care. So it should be really, to fill it out, being, not entities. Is the two things. Being is, but not entities are dependent on us. And now he just says another way, which is weird. Reality, not the real, is dependent upon care. If you hear that, if somebody said, look, Heidegger says reality depends on us, because we're certainly care. That's the structure of human beings. If somebody said, well, Heidegger says reality depends on us, you'd certainly think, gee, he certainly is some kind of idealist, some kind of constructivist. But then he goes on, and if somebody came around and said, Heidegger says the real doesn't depend on us, you'd think, gee, he's some kind of realist. That he's both, or neither. He's trying to have it both ways. And it's a long story, I think, how he thinks he gets it both ways and how he should do it and so forth. So on we go. Feel free to interrupt me when I lose you. I try to go slow and illustrate what I'm saying as I go. So both of those claims look like deflationary realism, as if Heidegger invented deflationary realism, because they apply equally to electrons and baseballs, right? The reality of them depends on us, and they don't. How many baseballs and how many electrons there are running around in the universe doesn't depend on us, but somehow what it is to be an electron maybe depends on us, and what it is to be a baseball certainly depends on us. And at the level of deflationary realism, there's no important difference. That's what makes a deflationary realist, to think that there's no important difference. Yes. An entity itself in itself. Entity, I couldn't hear you yet. Is being in its being? It's in itself and in its being. Yes, probably. An entity in its being. Well, I think you're asking a hard and a good question. I mean, let's just ask about the being of hammers or baseballs, either one. The hammer in itself is what is around, whether anybody happens to be using it or knowing it's there or not. And so the hammer in a certain way, some way, doesn't depend on us. But the being of the hammer does depend on us. That is, what it is to be a hammer is determined by our whole bunch of practices. So it looks like the being of the hammer depends on us for sure. And whether the hammer depends on us or not is part of the puzzle. Being depends on us, and even the being of the hammer depends on us, but entities like hammers are in themselves, in the sense that they don't, in some way they don't depend on us, and in some way they do depend on us, hammers. Now, remember I said last time you get the same thing with money that I got into with John Searle at one point. He wants to say, in general, that we make up a representation of things, and then it's up to the world whether there are any such things. And with money, you get the peculiar feature that without us, there wouldn't be any such thing as money. It's a result of our all agreeing to treat it as money. On the other hand, it doesn't depend on us how much money there is, or whether there is any money, or whether we have any money. The same puzzle occurs. So the being of money depends on us, but somehow the entities, the dollar bills, don't depend on us. They could be around after we are gone, and so forth. Yeah?
Well, could you attempt to give it a sort of relative property, kind of like independent status, by regarding its potential for producing money? And then in that case, is that referring to that?
Well, there's some kind of noise in the background. Everybody has to talk louder. Up from where I am, I can't hear you.
The hammer has the potential to be used as a hammer, and that's a way of holding its kind of observer relative properties.
Okay, well, the hammer has certain observer relative properties, that it has this potential to be used as a hammer. But there's something like the being, what it is to be a hammer, depends on us in a different sort of way. It's not something potential. It's something about the way the hammer fits in with our practices. It gets defined as what is used for hammering nails. The potentiality stuff is in there because it's defined in terms of its use, and therefore what it is to be a hammer depends on us.
Any property that is only evident through its use, and through our involvement with it, could be regarded
So you're trying to tell me how it could be independent, even though it's use-dependent. Yeah. Okay, well, that's one way to put it. It is. I mean, that's the puzzle. It is use-dependent and yet independent because it's still a hammer when we're not using it, maybe. I mean, that's an issue I don't want to go back to. We're going to try to do this discussion without talking about the ready-to-hand and the present-at-hand ways of being, I guess. But that complicates things because the ready-to-hand ways of being certainly are relative to us. That it can't be ready-to-hand except not even if it's just potential. It can't be ready-to-hand. Strictly speaking, it can't be fully ready-to-hand unless somebody's actually hammering with it. Whereas the hammer, when it's present at hand, which is just lying around, but still sort of counts as a hammer in the workshop, that doesn't depend on us actually using it, but it's got this potential. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. I don't think that's going to help us out of this big problem. So let's go on with it and see where we get. So now where does nature fit in? We're talking about hammers. I don't want to talk about electrons yet, but nature is very interesting and important in this. Heidegger is clear that nature depends on us even less than hammers depend on us because, hammers in some ways depend on our practices and in some ways don't. Nature maybe in no way depends on our practices. The dogs and the trees and the oceans and the electrons all seem to get along. We understand them as present at hand, and we understand that as decontextualized way of being that takes them out of the referential totality. So, and now we're looking at number 2 here. Number 2 is about nature. It's really over nature that the whole struggle between whether you believe that nature exists in itself, independent of us and our practices in some strong way, or whether nature is relative to the way we define it and encounter it. So let's look at nature, number 2. Nature has to be made present and accessible in its perceptual being and regularity in such a way that all of those moments, all of that means something like features or something. Moments is a funny word for there. Let's say all of the features are excluded, which through conditioning our access to the observation of nature interfere with it. That's a complicated way of saying you want to describe nature in such a way as to exclude whatever it is that you bring to the encounter with nature, which would keep you from understanding nature as it just plain was in itself. And he says, going on, this tendency what? To try to see nature, or actually to think one is seeing nature, independent of whatever you bring to it, when you look at it, you see it as it is in itself. This tendency first developed in such a way that rather than erecting a nexus of particular laws, it secured fundamental concepts. This happened in Greek philosophy. I'm going to interpret that as saying, I don't know exactly what Heidegger has in mind, but let's suppose he has in mind, Aristotle comes along. He's a great naturalist. He describes all sorts of plants and animals, and he describes physics and the way the world is, and he describes how things behave in the world and so forth, and he does it all, presumably, thinking, without maybe saying to himself, but the idea would be describe it leaving out any Aristotle relative aspects and just describe the falling objects and the trees and the animals and everything as they are in their natural state. And I put it that way because that might well be what Aristotle thought he was doing, but that's not what we think he was doing. Maybe that's why you have your hand up. If not, tell me why.
Yeah, I may be misremembering, but I seem to recall that even when Aristotle was doing all of this great research in animals and so forth, when he talked about the forms of animals, it was a very anthrocentric sort of notion, like
I see. Interesting.
relationship with humanity. That's what I remember.
Maybe. I was going to give a different example, but which is fine. They fit together. I don't know whether Aristotle thought he was describing nature as it was in itself, but he wasn't, according to our science, because he was talking about things seeking their natural place, and so light things were going up and heavy things were going down, and they were going down because they were pulled or they had a tendency to go down if they were heavy. And he has, I think, lots. I mean, Adam would know better than me. A lot of human relative stuff built into his view of nature, I suppose, or maybe not. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure that that's so much the issue as to what extent the interpretation of the entities under discussion is specifically put into relationship with humanity or in relationship with the observer.
And the answer is what? It isn't, I suppose. Is that right?
Well, I mean, there isn't a whole lot of explicit methodological discussion of empirical science in Aristotle. So how he viewed what he was doing when he was gathering all that biological information is not exactly clear. But certainly he wants to say that all things are tied together in this hierarchy of actuality, of ends, that has its complete fulfillment in the unmoved mood. But he does want to certainly wants to tie the interpretation of all tools back to the person, the people that made them, to by which the efficient cause, and the ultimate purpose
Yeah.
for which they're used.
Okay. Yeah, tools. But now the interesting thing is whether when he's talking about nature that it hasn't been made for us and our purposes, how much he sort of still, from his sense of the world, brings in. I'm going to make up a caricature because all I really need is that. I mean, let's suppose he thinks that things have a tendency to go down and seek their natural place, and other things have a tendency to go up because their natural place is up in the sky beyond the moon, and so forth. I mean, if he had that sort of view, it would show that he had not yet totally de-worlded nature. He'd done something like desituated it, because I'm sure he already thought that hammers, if they had hammers, and they must have had things like that he must have thought that you could desituate them, that is, not treat them as for hammering, and not treat them as, say, too heavy, but just treat them as a shank of wood with a metal blob on the end. That would get you a certain distance in your belief that now you were just describing nature. But he certainly hasn't left everything out. And what exactly he hasn't left out would be a great subject for study, and I'm sure people have been worrying about it for years. But Heidegger goes on to say that modern physics makes a further step. That's number 3 on your handout. Modern physics led to the discovery of laws of motion, defining them in a way that was free. Now notice, this is the crucial thing. Free of any reference to the contingencies of its access, measurement, and defining of them. You sort of want to underline that. I mean, that's what I think Aristotle wasn't free yet. Galileo comes in, and Galileo really thinks, and maybe does, describe the motion of objects independent of up and down, independent of near and far, and so forth. Anything that's relative to us, maybe, is, or at least let us suppose, or at least Heidegger seems to be supposing, that you can get rid of any reference to the whatever it is that we bring that gives us access to that. So that's like saying, well, electrons are radically different than baseballs because, well, never mind. That's a funny way to put it, isn't it? I hadn't thought of that. It's like saying, never mind electrons and baseballs. There's something that they both have in common, which is radically independent of us, and that is they obey the laws of motion. They have inertia, and they have mass, and they obey the laws that describes, and those laws are described in a way that's independent of us. That's what Heidegger thinks we've got in modern physics. And then, just in case, you don't have to really read this, but he wants to sort of hedge people are going around saying, and they still are, oh, but look, the theory of relativity finally shows that speed and location and all that is relative to an observer. And Heidegger wants to say, yes, but we have absolute knowledge of even the kind of relativity. He says the theory of relativity took seriously the idea of an absolute knowledge of nature. It's not a theory about the relative validity of physical laws. It inquires into those conditions of definition and measurement that make it possible for nature to be grasped purely in terms of itself and its laws of motion to be understood. Those are strong, strong claims, and very sort of robust realist claims. He seems to be saying that insofar that nature, particularly as studied by modern physics, has whatever structure and character it has, completely independent of how we come across it, measure it, define it, and all the things he lists there. Those are all, this is going to be a refrain that comes up again and again, so you might as well get used to it. Those are all contingent. That is, they are accidents of the way we access the laws of motion. But what is essential and not contingent is what we find out by our theories about the laws of motion. And if you're going to be a robust realist, you have to make all of our access practices contingent. That is, accidental. They in no way define what it is you're getting access to. Whereas clearly our access practices to baseballs and such things are not totally independent of what we gain access to. They're part of defining. It's constitutive of baseballs to have certain shape and structure defined by the rules and to behave in certain ways that if they floated up into the air when you hit them, they wouldn't do as baseballs and so forth. We define what the essence of a hammer or a baseball is. But it seems Heidegger's saying when you get to modern physics, we don't define anything about what the entity is, except we let the entity tell us what it is. Our defining is contingent. That's very strong and interesting. So now where are we? Let me see. So, yeah, we got to modern physics. Okay. And that would be the robust reading of those two sentences. That would make sense of the idea, well, but we better spell it out, that being depended on us, but that the beings don't. How would that fit, say, Galileo? Well, this is very tricky and obscure now, and I'm sure you're all going to call me on it, and I don't know what to say. But I'll say it now, and I'll get in trouble later. It looks like what he's saying is that, of course, the intelligibility of electrons and the laws of motion and all that depends on us. Because being depends on us. And being, remember, is that on the basis of which beings are understood. And that means sort of the background intelligibility that gives us access to electrons and enables us to make sense of them as things in nature. That depends on us, even though all the particulars of it, I mean, that's the tricky part. Even though what are the measurement, the defining, and all that depends on the electrons. What's up to them, what spin, charge, weight, and so forth they've got. Now, that you're looking puzzled. I think you're right to be puzzled. I think I'll tell you the most puzzling version of it, as long as you're already puzzled. I mean, the way you make sense of things in nature, according to modern physics, is that you understand them as present at hand. And what is it to understand them as present at hand? Well, that's tricky. You understand them as independent of our practices. That's all right, except then you get this head-splitting fact that that's one of our practices, namely coming across entities and defining them independent of our practices. So that's, and and if you spin it one way, that you say, aha, that's robust realism. We have practices for encountering entities as they are, independent of our practices. That's how we make them intelligible as present at hand. But if you're an anti-realist, you say, yes, look at that. We have these amazing practices. We can come across these things and treat them and think about them as they are in themselves. That's what we do. And therefore, even being present at hand is somehow relative to our practices. That's the head-splitting thing. And I think Heidegger's going to claim, if I understand him right, that for nature, no. If I even say this, it's going to be confusing. I'm confused. I'm not confused. I think it's intrinsically confusing. Let me think. So Heidegger's got to say something like, the practices for making sense of things independent of our practices are themselves contingent. That is, it doesn't matter to the electron that we've got practices for treating things as present at hand. It's finally what we have is ways of encountering things as, well, you see, go around in circles, as independent of those ways of encountering things. I can't do any better. You just have to keep this in mind. All the time, the question is going to be, when you say that the being of these entities depends on us, these entities meaning like electrons, how are you hearing that? You've got to hear it as, that means that none of our access practices make any difference to electrons. They're all contingent. And it means somehow our practices for making them intelligible doesn't even finally get a grip on them. Now, hold on that, because that's where things get really interesting and weird. But I want to keep letting you have a chance to talk, because I think this is all interesting and weird and hard. And are you getting it? Is it okay so far? You're not lost, I hope? Okay. When you get lost, yeah. Okay, now let's see where we are. Heidegger needs to show, let's see, So what's the ontological question? Here's a new puzzle, the thing to keep clear about, which everybody falls into, and I do too sometimes. We're asking an ontological question. That is, we're not asking the epistemological question, how would Aristotle know, or Galileo know, whether they were describing the electrons as they were in themselves, utterly independent of the background that they were bringing, the forehaving they were bringing. Obviously, Aristotle didn't know. And maybe Galileo didn't know either, because maybe something in his story was still human smuggled in. I don't know. He certainly thought he was outside. In his dialogues on two world systems, he's the first to try to describe everything he's talking about. He says constantly, sort of as if he were standing outside the world and outside of everything when you're describing it. He really thought he had de-worlded. And so the epistemological question might be, well, had he really de-worlded? Aristotle hadn't, and how will we ever know if we get everything de-worlded? That's not the right question. If you ask that question, the answer is we won't ever know. But that's not the point. The point is ontological, not epistemological. Can we make sense of the way we encounter things, of things in themselves whose properties and whose nature is totally independent of our encountering things? You see, maybe someday, if we can make sense of it, then we can say, well, maybe someday we'll actually ever do it, or maybe we already did it with Galileo or with Newton. We'll never know for sure. Maybe Einstein finally did it. That's not interesting. The interesting thing is, does it even make sense if you think of us as always having a forehaving, of always having to bring a whole procedure for disclosing and opening up a space in which we encounter anything? Can we make sense of us, that kind of being that we are, encountering beings that have absolutely no reference to us, but are independent of us in themselves and so forth? Now, and I think we can. I think Heidegger thinks we can. I think that's what he thinks we find in nature, or modern science has found in nature. But now we have a long way to go. So let me go on. Keep in mind where we are. Okay, let me see now. So we want to know whether we can make sense of things in nature, that is, the things in the universe, that is, things like electrons, as in no way dependent upon us and our practices, even in our practices for opening up a world in which things can be encountered. So, and Heidegger wants to agree with the deflationary realist that all modes of being, of making sense of things, of encountering things, depends on us. But he still wants to say, aha, yeah, but things could be. It makes sense to think that things might be totally, absolutely independent of us. Then we would be encountering something as purely present at hand, I think you could say. Although, unfortunately, he doesn't say that way. But I would like to say that way. You'd be encountering things as purely present at hand. You would be doing pure discovering. I mean, it's unfortunate for this difficult discussion that Heidegger doesn't use the terms pure present at hand and pure discovering in the robust realist way I just used them. When he's talking about it, you'll see. I just got that shock 2 days ago. For the first time, I opened my eyes and read the text and discovered it isn't quite using the terms the way I want him to use them. But that's not the crucial thing. The crucial thing is something like, can we genuinely de-world? Another way to put it, genuinely get out of the hermeneutic circle. Genuinely describe things in which our forehaving plays no constitutive role, or can't we? And we have to find out more. It looks like we can't, because meaning, encountering, the clearing, the world, and being itself, intelligibility, all depend on Dasein. When you say that, you don't know what's left when you say that beings don't, except some kind of minimal stuff that, of course, how many dollars you got isn't up to you just by thinking about it. But it doesn't look like you could have a strong understanding of that beings don't. A strong, robust understanding of beings don't would mean, electrons, like I keep repeating, have their charge, have their spin, have their weight, and they have it completely, whether we ever existed or not, whether anybody ever discovered electrons or not. How can we get that strong conclusion? It all depends on our sense of access to them. That is, at the bottom of 255, he says, only if the understanding of being is, do entities as entities become accessible. If you hear that, you can hear that as in a deflationary realist, that is, anti-realist, really, way. You can say that, well, just as I thought, if you're one of them. So the understanding of being makes the entities accessible. But you can hear it another way. Yeah, fine. We have to have access practices to get to electrons. And it's true that our own understanding of being has to be in place, and a whole lot of other practices too, before electrons could become accessible. That they're not constituted, it's the same point again, by what all the stuff we have to do to make them accessible. They've got whatever structure they've got. And it's really the introduction of this notion of accessible, which is really, I think, an important move in Heidegger. The constitutive people think that somehow our access practices in some way shape or color or something the things we have access to. And Heidegger's keeping at least an open mind about whether we couldn't have access to something whereby the access made absolutely no difference to what we were having access. That would be, again, robust realism. That would be the strong sense in which being depends on us. That's our access practices. And beings don't. That's the electrons. That's one way of reading those wonderfully puzzling sentences. So, and we're getting to the interesting crunch now. This gets very funny in a moment. So bear with it. Maybe not quite yet. On 254, Heidegger gets to his most seemingly making everything depend on us at the bottom of 254. About 5 lines into that last section on reality and care. Being in the sense of pure present at hand, he's going to talk about. Not all present at hand is present at hand of things. Now comes the physics part. The nature by which we are surrounded is, of course, an entity within the world. Don't get fooled by that. Electrons get flying around in the world. That's sort of nice to talk about electrons because they really are equipment in the world. Electrons can be used to fire out of electron guns onto cathode ray tubes and make pictures and oscilloscopes. So it isn't that you can't sort of capture an electron and make it into a piece of equipment. But the point is whether when you're not capturing it and it's running around in some other galaxy, it's whether the fact that we can make it into equipment makes any difference. The answer is I think it shouldn't. So where are we? Nature by which we are surrounded is, of course, an entity within the world. Dogs, trees, electrons, all that stuff are in the world. But the kind of being which it shows, nature, belongs neither to the ready to hand nor to the present at hand as things of nature. So now that's interesting. No matter how this being of nature may be interpreted, all the modes of being of entities within the world are founded ontologically upon the worldhood of the world and accordingly upon the phenomenon of being in the world. Wow. So on the one hand, he's saying, well, the things of nature are not going to be ready or intelligible as ready to hand, nor even as present at hand, but whatever they are, all the modes of being of entities within the world are founded upon the worldhood of the world. Yes, but of course the trick there is that's not a strong anti-realist claim. That says when electrons are in the world, when people are using them to shoot at something or other, then of course they've got all the characteristics of being in the world. But the things of nature, when they're just in nature, don't, I think. But there's one more move you have to pay attention to. And this is the one where if you thought the puzzle about we have practices to deal with things such as they are independent of our practices is puzzling, this one is the one I don't really understand at all. Suppose you say, well, we make electrons intelligible. We treat them as present at hand when they're out there in the universe. That's our way of being. That's why their being depends upon us. We're the ones who see them as present at hand. And in general, we make them intelligible as having a certain structure, a certain spin, and so forth. But as soon as we do all that, then we're in trouble, because then it looks like we can't, not only epistemologically, can't ever be sure that we haven't smuggled in our own human forehaving, but we're ontologically not in any position to say that we haven't. That's the important thing. We're not in an ontological position. If the intelligibility of everything depends on us, then it's hard to see how we can say, aha, but they don't depend on us at all. They are absolutely independent of us, and whether we were ever around or not. So it looks like what he's got to say is, what science deals with isn't even intelligible. That's how independent of us it is. But that's an outrageous thing to have to say. But that's what he does say. I mean, he really bites the bullet. That's the main reason I handed out the handout, is you've got to see it to believe it. The most peculiar talk. But I forgot to remember where it is in. I want you to see it first as you have it in front of you in Being and Time, and then because it's condensed to one sentence. Help! I've lost it again. Where it's in the Understanding chapter, so I have to find the Understanding chapter. It's on the left-hand side of the page at the bottom. Here it is on 194. Write that in there after the thing I'm about to read, which is number 4 in your handout, because that's typical. It's fun anyway. Typical of Heidegger saying something at great length or some length in a lecture, and then saying it which is already incomprehensible, and then saying it in a completely incomprehensible, condensed way in Being and Time. So here we are at the bottom of Being and Time. I got to explain something to explain this. What Heidegger's assuming here is something that everybody believed in those days, and I still believe, that there's a basic difference between understanding and explaining. That goes to a philosopher, historian named Dilthey, but you don't have to know that. But there is understanding, verstehen, that's the same kind of word, it's understanding. And there is explaining. Erklären. And now, understanding is what you do in the human sciences, Dilthey said, and in the everyday world. You put things in a bunch of in a context which makes them intelligible to us in terms of our purposes, our perception, our skill. We understand each other. We understand the economy and money, and we understand the activity of science. When if you say the physical world was shocked at the discovery of a fifth force, you understand what that means, because that's about the practices of the physicists. But the universe, you are explaining. I mean, Dilthey didn't have this distinction, world and universe. Heidegger barely has it. He says it once in Basic Problems. I think it's very helpful to have a universe here. The universe isn't shocked by the discovery of a fifth force. There just is a fifth force, it looks like, and if there is, that's all right. That's how it is. We have theories to explain what's going on in the universe, and we don't understand them. We don't understand what's going on. Not that we don't understand it because we just haven't found out enough about the fifth force. Nothing you could find out about the fifth force or the universe counts as understanding in this distinction, because understanding always relates to us and our purposes and our moods and our for the sake of whiches. And it only counts as explaining if it doesn't relate to us. This is where it starts with the laws of motion in Galileo. He's going to explain why all things fall at the same rate, for instance, and he's going to explain it. But he's not going to understand it in the sense that it's not going to relate to us. Now, all that is in the background when Heidegger says in one sentence, after the italics, the assimilation of understanding and interpretation to an indefinite ideal of knowledge is not the issue here. Now, this ideal of knowledge is explaining. Such an ideal is itself only a subspecies of understanding. A subspecies, so he has a broader notion of understanding than I was giving you. But what's important is, I'll explain in a minute, a subspecies which has strayed into the legitimate task of grasping the present at hand in its essential unintelligibility. That's what I want you to see. He's not going to use understanding and explaining here, but what he's really saying is there is understanding, and there is something else, which he says is a kind of understanding, but I don't like that, and Dilthey wouldn't like it either, I don't think. There is something other than understanding, which has, and I love this weird phrase, strayed into the legitimate task. What does that mean? It means that, amazingly enough, Galileo stumbled on a way of dealing with motion that actually seems to be outside of the world, deworlded, independent of his Vorhabe, doesn't talk about anything seeking its natural place, doesn't talk about what keeps things moving. He just says they just keep moving because inertia is one of the features of it. It's an accident that there is anything worth talking about that is totally independent, that may well be, you have to keep saying, because you get rid of the epistemological claim. I mean, it may well be that Galileo has found something, and Newton further, and Einstein further, which is independent of any reference to any way we make any sense of anything. That's what it would have to be. And then it would, he's straight into it, because who would have thought there would be such a thing? And it's legitimate in that, yes, it looks like there really is such a thing as far as we can tell. There really is a way of describing things that treats them in a way that makes them not even, and now comes the punchline, intelligible to us. Because remember, we want to get something so independent of us that it isn't in no way influenced by what we can understand, what we're going to describe now. Well, that's pretty weird. But now, having read that weird sentence, look at the place where he spells it out completely, or a lot more completely, and in a way, bizarrely, at the bottom of the number 4. Here's the long version, which I hope is it's in the History of Concept of Time. So every explanation, when we seek of an explanation of nature, is distinguished by its involvement in the incomprehensible. See, the opposite of the intelligible. In some funny sense, electrons are incomprehensible. At least it's this sense. They don't fit into our referential totality. They don't connect up with our for the sake of which. There's no reason why there should be electrons, the way Aristotle thought there was a reason why there should be horses. They are, in that sense, at least incomprehensible. But I think that I have to jump ahead. I think Heidegger would love quantum physics, where things are getting more and more incomprehensible all the time, and that's and far from being an objection, that's more and more evidence, if you had an epistemological concern, that we may well be describing them in a way that makes no reference to our way of making things intelligible. That's very upsetting about quantum physics. I don't even like it, but that's the way it goes. So let's read it again now. Science deals with the incomprehensible, second sentence. It can be flatly stated that explanation, that's this one, is the expository interpretation of the incomprehensible. Not so that this exposition would let us comprehend the incomprehensible. That would be like saying, well, it's an electron, it's ready to hand. Somehow that already is not what's important. What's important is there is an X, and it has a something or other. We can call it a charge and a mass and a spin, but those are all formal relations of it that we don't really understand them. We can't picture them. We can't relate to them. For it remains incomprehensible in principle. Nature does. That is, we can't bring it in relation to our way of understanding things. And how does it go on? Nature is, turn the page, is what is in principle explainable and to be explained because it is in principle incomprehensible. It is the incomprehensible pure and simple. And it is the incomprehensible because it is the unworlded world insofar as we take nature in this extreme sense of the entity as it's discovered in physics. Well, that's the robust realism claim. I mean, if you can make sense of that, which I don't know whether I can or not, I just don't know what it is to say that electrons are incomprehensible already, even at the time of Bohr, let alone. I mean, I can understand more and more what it's like to be incomprehensible when something isn't a particle and it isn't a wave and it does all kinds of weird things like electrons. Now it turns out they do, but it's still incomprehensible in principle. That is, there is no way of connecting it up to our practices for making sense of things. I don't know what that means, but I know what Heidegger's trying to say. I mean, physics de-worlds. And if physics really thoroughly de-worlds, it gets rid of all forehaving. It gets rid of all of our practices for making things intelligible. Those are access practices. It doesn't get rid of them. I mean, it doesn't throw out. You don't have to throw out your spectrograph in your electron microscope, but it leaves out of the description of the theory anything that has to do with the way we make sense of the kind of things that we encounter in the world. And so, as I say, he bites the bullet. He wants to say that physics actually d worlds. Or I think you always ought to be qualifying it. It's something like it looks like physics actually with d worlds. It may well be that physics actually d worlds. It makes sense, that's the tricky part, to think of a physics as an activity that d worlds. That's robust realism, I presume. Yeah, Tyler, say something. People are looking zombified, and understandably so.
Just the way you described it, there's a passage on 191 very close to what you just read. And it seems to me he's describing a process not whereby we get rid of the four-having structure. Rather, the four-having structure becomes more adequate to the entities in themselves. Does it describe the one in which science gets into a position where the four-having doesn't interfere at all?
That's what I think, yes.
Yeah. Well, there's this passage on 191 that seems to be talking about you're always going to encounter two or four structures.
Well, let's look at it. Let's look at it. But let's see. The issue is whether we got to, before we read it, we have to set up our what we're looking for. I mean, surely the four structure is there in our access practices. The question is whether the four structure is constitutive in any way of what we get access to, or whether our access practices are completely contingent. That is, we've got that access structure, and without it, we wouldn't be able to get to electrons, but the four structure plays no role in what it is to be an electron. That would be the version that I claim he holds. So let's look at 191. I think it's great that we've got a test case. The alternative, just let me say, would seem to be that I think Tyler's introduced a new possibility. That it sounds like, well, the access practices are accidentally exactly give us the structure that's really there. That would be sort of a godlike picture. I mean, I forget whether it's Einstein or Galileo that I think let's suppose it's Einstein who said something like, well, what if the universe were all complicated like that? And then Einstein or Galileo, whoever it was, said, well, then God would give us the kind of mind that was able to understand something complicated like that. And that's what's really sort of, if you think that the access practices, even though they don't in any way constitute what you're dealing with, actually capture the structure of what you're dealing with, rather than thinking, oh, well, no, that's it. If you think that, it's very mysterious. You see, it's mysterious because you wouldn't think that the access practices that you've got would set you up unless you're the last of the religious scientists, I think, like Einstein. You wouldn't think that somehow God had made your mind so that your access practices, though completely contingent and in no way constitutive of the structure of the universe, were exactly getting at the structure of the universe, and therefore it looks like the world ought to be intelligible. I mean, that's what Einstein thought. He thought all of quantum theory, he thought till he died that all quantum theory must be wrong because it's not intelligible even to his mind, and his mind was pretty good. That is, why would we have access practices which give us the structure of a reality completely independent of us? It's well, yeah. I mean, I like what Tyler's saying. I mean, the only alternative to the view that I'm talking about, and I think Heidegger's holding, namely that what we get at is unintelligible, finally, and that we've got a sort of we've got theories which less and less make any sense to us, but they still enable us to predict things. And that's one possibility. And the other possibility is, isn't it amazing the universe in our mind are in such rapport that the more we understand about electrons and so forth, and forces, the more it fits with just what we'd expect it to be, something like that. So let's before you talk, where's the passage I should be reading to try to understand this?
It's the middle passage in 191.
Okay, that would be, because this is really interesting to look at, and it is definitely about the forehaving. How much do we have to read?
This is on where he's talking about foreconception. And I want the passage that says introduction interpretation.
Wait, I've got to find it yet. In this middle paragraph.
Middle paragraph, I'd say about near the end, after footnote number 3.
Okay, got it. Anything understood? That. Yeah.
There, the next sentence.
Okay, let me read it to my out loud. Anything understood which is held in our forehaving and towards which we set our sights foresightedly becomes conceptualizable through interpretation. Notice, anything. In such an interpretation, the way in which the entity we interpret is to be conceived can be drawn from the entity itself, or the interpretation can force the entity into concepts into which it is opposed in its manner of being. In either case, the interpretation is already decided for a definite way of conceiving, that's the foreconception, either with finality or with reservations. It is grounded in something we grasp in advance in a foreconception. Well, now, I don't know yet what, I mean, but I would say, yes, that's about interpretation. That's about understanding. That's about how we deal with anything in the world, that is, with anything that's intelligible to us. I don't think that's about the de-worlded, pure discovery that he gets to when he talks about science.
I think when he's talking about the entity in itself, though, he has a foreconception which can violently sort of impose itself on the entity. And it seems to be another possibility, which is the type of foreconception which lets the entity be in itself.
Yes, because in itself is very tricky, and I should have warned you about that, all of you. I used to think that when Heidegger said in itself, he had always in mind the strong understanding of in itself, which goes with robust realism. And what I've been saying, electrons have the structure and charge they do in themselves, meaning without any reference to any of our ways of making sense of them or of getting at them. But he also talks about how hammering deals with in effect, nails in themselves. And because there's always this ambiguity about the in itself, whether it just means as an entity sort of which you can distinguish from the other entities, or whether it means an entity that bears no relation to anything, including us. And this is going to be, as I read it, here's the simplest way to put it, this is not about theory. This is about something else than theory. This is how we understand, importantly, something like, let's say, I don't know, the Chinese economy. Now, if you have the wrong sort of preconceptions that somehow free enterprise is what everybody is really doing and everybody's out satisfying their desires, it might be, I don't know if there's a good example. Probably in my story, that it should be try to understand the Japanese economy as if everybody had individual desires and was out to satisfy them. That was the free market. That was what made the economy work. You won't get very far if the story I was telling about how the Japanese are much more sort of consensus-oriented and not trying to satisfy each person their own desires. Let's suppose that's how it is. Then it looks like you bring the wrong forehaving to bear. You won't be able to understand what's going on. And if you bring the right forehaving to bear, namely that it's all social and holistic, you would have an understanding. That's one thing this could mean. That would be how to get the wrong forehaving in the world, and how if you're going to do social science, you better have the right forehaving. And you better even have the right forehaving if you're trying to understand your neighbor who happens to always be pulling up your flowers or something. You're trying to get the right understanding of what might be upsetting him or something. Then you could have a wrong view, or you could get right about it. So now Eugene wanted to say something.
It just seems like it sounds extra paradoxical because we're saying unintelligibility, right? That's a really strong word. So something's really unintelligible, and you can't really explain it.
We need a weaker word.
So to me, it seems more intuitive that you remember the part about understanding and connected to familiarity, right? So electrons are unfamiliar, and in a way they can never be familiar to us, but we can grasp them anyway in their familiarity. And like if you do math problems with an infinite number of dimensions, they're unintelligible in a way, but they're not really unintelligible. They're just unfamiliar and unfamiliarizable.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe we have to say that. Heidegger certainly doesn't give us any help if he's trying to say that.
It's ununderstandable in this respect.
Yeah.
Because of understanding that he describes, that with familiarity and
Okay, well, that's sort of what I think, too. That is, he's saying you can't bring what's incomprehensible and unintelligible can't be brought into relation to the referential totality and our purposes and stuff, for sure. That may be all it means. If so, then it's not a strong move toward the claim of robust realism, but you don't need it as a strong move. If you could claim, as he does, but you need an argument, which he doesn't have, that our access practices could be totally contingent. I mean, one way you get there is, well, the way I got there, by saying, well, that is, there must be, whatever it is, if our access practices are totally contingent, then the thing must be, whatever it is, independent of any of the ways we make sense of it. And that might be all right, but now we're getting sort of close to Tyler. I mean, it's independent of any way we make sense of it, and lo and behold, lucky for us, we've strayed into a way of making sense of it that corresponds to its structure. That would be less crazy. And I think that's all right. Heidegger never talks that way. Now, I don't know why, but keep your eyes open. See, why not say, it's luck, it's an accident, Galileo strayed into it. It's amazing that we've got so far with relativity and quantum physics. String theory is even more weird with how many 13 or something degrees of freedom. We can't think it at all. But maybe it's the way things are. But if it is the way things are, then we've got some kind of grasp on it. That's what you're saying and Tyler's saying. Wait, one thing. And why don't I say that too? Why don't I just give up the unintelligibility ploy, which I told you was driving me crazy because I couldn't make any sense out of it, and just take him wanting the contingency ploy. That is, he wants to assert that it belongs to the being of nature, that our access to it is in no way constitutive of what it is. That fits with what you said and Tyler said. So let's say it that way. We're still a robust realist, but we now don't have to claim that what we believe about, what our theories about X don't correspond to X. They do correspond to X if we're lucky, and it works very well, and science seems to work very well. That's all right. The important thing is that the theories don't now, and we believe, though we can't prove it, that our theories in no way impose a structure on what's there. See, that's the crucial thing. The practices by which we make sense of it aren't what's making it the thing it is. The way the practices that we make sense of baseballs makes baseballs the way they are. We've got to make that move. But the move's already made. That's where I said underline the stuff on page 1. We want to talk about physics getting the laws of motion free of any reference to the contingencies of access, measurement, and defining them. We want to get them purely in terms of the laws of motion to be understood. Okay, now you want to say something.
Just in an effort to better understand Heidegger's reasons for saying that these scientific entities are unintelligible.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Would it really be so bad to just take the opposite conclusion and say that we can never escape our practices and say, like, thinking of science instead of this sort of cold, hard, clean set of theories that really is the universe, instead thinking of it as our efforts to create predictive systems, the only way we can, sort of being as we are, and sort of thinking, I mean, there's this tendency to think of science as very, like, exactly like the world is, and looking at these formulas and being like, this is how the universe works. But if we thought of it differently, would that really cause any problems for Heidegger's phenomenology?
Good question. No, I don't. I guess not. I mean, I have to think about it. It would cause a problem for me just because I want to be a robust realist, and it might cause a problem because I think he wants to be a robust realist. But you could say, well, science could get along fine if we were all deflationary realists or constructivists and said that the world we're discovering by way of science is in part structured by our own activity, and luckily for us, we can predict anyway and get things anyway. Yeah, I mean, you can all just get off this weird trip that I've been on for the whole lecture simply by by giving up the idea that there is pure deworlding, pure discovery, that there is a way the universe is independent of us, that electrons really do have a charge and a mass and a spin, period. And but I mean, I just think that just feels wrong. But I'm of another generation. I have a feeling that more and more people are going to feel that because Nietzsche thinks that it's all constructed, and Nietzsche's usually sort of ahead of what people find believable. Yeah.
Isn't it Heidegger kind of significant that although we could look at it as kind of a predictive strategy, that we don't, that we do in fact, in big time observations, we kind of think that's the way of thinking itself, and that, you know.
Yeah, good. Yes, I see what you're saying, and I want to sort of go fast because I don't want to come back to realism, and I've got only 4 minutes or something. Yes, I think Heidegger thinks something like, look, if you do the phenomenology of nature, and you find that what we think about nature is that it's in itself, that it's independent of us, that our access to it in no way constitutes it and gives it a structure, and then he wants to sort of ask, well, how would you make sense of that? And he's going to give you, on 408, this story, which I don't have to go over, luckily, because time is running out, how you get from hammering. Remember, he wants to tell you the way theoretical discovery happens. He wants to give you an existential conception of science. And then he tells it to you on 412, how you go from the hammer is transparently working to the hammer has weight, to the hammer has mass, and is subject to the laws of gravity. And it looks like he's telling you how theory, what he calls theoretical discovering, becomes more and more and more disconnected from the world, and that he believes that. And now I want to say one more quick thing. So he would put together his derivation of theory as more and more deworlding, with his intuition that our understanding of nature is completely deworlded, and try to get you to believe that. What I want to say, and maybe some of you too, well, what's the argument, Heidegger? How can we know anything about nature in which our access is contingent? Well, the punch is that Heidegger talks about the essence of the things in nature. Number 5. Oh, I'm going to run out of time, but give me another 3 minutes, maybe. I'm not sure it's number 5. That is just what I needed. I've something about essence in here. Oh, yeah, it is number 5. Interworldliness is accordingly not an extant property, that is present-at-hand property, a present-at-hand things. A present-at-hand things are the kind of things they are, even if they do not become interworldly, even if world entry doesn't happen to them and there is no occasion for it at all. Interworldliness does not belong to the essence of occurrent things as such, but is only the transcendental condition in the primordial sense for the possibility of present-at-hand things being able to emerge as they are. Now, if there were such a thing as the essence of present-at-hand things, then we could, that's the missing argument he needs, because then we could discover the essential properties and they would be independent of all the contingent aspects that we use to get them. So if for instance, one quick example, if gold has an atomic weight of 79, I think it is, and if that explains all the other causal properties of gold, then when you found the essence of gold, you found something that is independent of our access practices. But you have to believe that there are two things. You have to believe, and Heidegger should have, because he believes in essences, and he believes in formal indication. In crypty language, how many know about rigid designation? It's the same thing. And so Heidegger had all he needed, a belief in essences and a belief that we could designate something by by just sort of pointing out at it and then working it over to find out finally what its essential structure was. That would give him what he needs to support number 5 here. Because then he could say that we could find out about something in which the purely deworlded, all we would need to know is its essence, and then we'd have the kind of science I think he thinks that we do have, period. We're going to go on to truth next time. If those of you who like to think about this stuff could write a paper on it, I think it's really interesting. Or you can just forget it and not have to suffer with it anymore.